Dennis O'Rourke.
Mr Speaker, this is a very important bill for the future of Christchurch. Indeed, it may be the most important bill for the future of Christchurch that has ever been presented to this House, and it therefore needs thorough scrutiny. I'm happy to say that it does enable a transition from recovery, a recovery which is far from complete, of course, to regeneration, and it does provide for a genuine partnership approach, which I think is very pleasing, and that is now essential. It provides for a new entity in Regenerate Christchurch as a vehicle which will concentrate council and Crown efforts and assets, and that too is positive. It also contains a number of extraordinary powers, perhaps too many extraordinary powers, and I'm going to refer to those later. Mr Speaker, New Zealand First does approve of the concept in this bill, but we do have one very particular reservation, which I will describe later, and so we will vote in favour of the bill to the Select Committee. But if that reservation is not later met or satisfied, then we will not then hesitate to vote against it if necessary. So I'll refer to that later, but I want to go on and say this, that I think the purpose of the bill is very well set out, and it focuses on two things, on regeneration and on local leadership. And Mr Speaker, I see from the dictionary that the word regenerate means to recreate in a better form or condition, and that's going to be the challenge for the new process. And it's going to be a challenge more than anything in three particular areas: how the red zone is regenerated or recreated, how New Brighton is recreated because it desperately needs it, having received far too little attention so far, and I agree with several other speakers who have referred to transport as a particular area in which Christchurch and Canterbury need a much better result. They need more options than just more motorways, bigger roads and more cars. We do need to see better treatment for rail, light rail, cycling and other forms of transport, and they do need to be integrated. And Mr Speaker, it's particularly positive that there's also a focus on local leadership, because the input of ECAN, the Selwyn District Council, Waimakariri District Council, of course the Christchurch City Council and Ngāi Tahu is absolutely essential if we are going to take the people of Christchurch and the people of Canterbury with us in this process. That process has not in fact been well carried out so far under the Sarah Act. It's been lacking in the past, and Canterbury people need to be able to take ownership of this process, and unless that partnership is carried out genuinely and comprehensively, we won't get that. So I hope that is the result of this bill. And Mr Speaker, Regenerate Christchurch does mean recreation, and it's very important that that happen in a leadership way. And I'm very pleased to see, therefore, that under Section 90, under Clause 95, there will be a board of 7 members, 3 appointed by the City Council, 3 by the Crown and 1 effectively by Ngāi Tahu. I don't think there'll be any need to change that over the period that this bill will operate. I think that's a good balance, and it's good that they will have to agree on things. So I approve of that. But Mr Speaker, I also particularly approve of Section 97, which provides how that partnership will operate, and it says that it makes a provision for the City Council and the Minister to agree on how they will exercise their respective roles and responsibilities in relation to Regenerate Christchurch, and that the role of the City Council and the Minister is to jointly oversee and manage the Crown's interests in Regenerate Christchurch, and in particular that the City Council and the Minister may produce a letter of expectation as a means of overseeing and managing the Council's and the Crown's interests in Regenerate Christchurch. So I hope and expect that we will see that letter not too far in the future, so we will know what they intend in that regard. But that's a good basis upon which a partnership should proceed. And Mr. Speaker, this concept of regeneration, or as I've defined it, recreation, is at the heart of the bill. And I note with some satisfaction that the Minister, in making decisions concerning those regeneration plans, must seek the views of the strategic partners, that is to say ECAN, the City Council, Selwyn, Waimakariri and of course Ngāi Tahu. And I'm particularly pleased about the words, have particular regard to their views, because that means not just listen to what they say, but to actually effectively incorporate their views in whatever the plans are. So it will not be open to the Minister to simply decide what he thinks is best. He will in fact have to do as the bill says and have proper regard to the views of those stakeholders. And I'm very pleased about that and approve particularly of that part of the bill. Those words, particular regard to their views, I think are probably the most important words in the bill as a whole. I want to move on now, however, to the powers that are contained in the bill. They are extraordinary powers, and they're really just as extraordinary as the powers that were in the SARA legislation. And I have no difficulty in saying that actually those powers are needed. If we are going to get the recreation of Christchurch, particularly in the ways that I've mentioned, then yes, there do need to have to be extraordinary powers to make sure that that can happen. And there's a whole list of those about suspending, amending or revoking RMA documents. I do take on board what Eugenia Sage said about that. There is some risk associated with that, but on balance I do think it's appropriate that those powers are there. And there are other powers about amalgamating land, about the Chief Executive being able to commission works, about the Chief Executive being able to dispose of land subject to the Minister's approval, and also this very difficult question of the Minister being able to compulsorily acquire land. And that is where I think that the problem lies in this bill. And that's where New Zealand First has a serious reservation, because the Minister's power to decide compensation under this bill is far too wide. And I want to refer to section 80(2)(3) to 6, which say in 3, when determining the amount of compensation for the compulsory acquisition of land, the Minister must have regard to the matters in subsection 4, which include the Public Works Act consideration and those sorts of things, but is not limited to determining the amount of compensation on that basis alone. Quote, and may determine whatever amount the Minister thinks fit, close quote. If those words remain in the bill, New Zealand First will vote against it in the future stages. And the reason I say that is simply this. I and New Zealand First have been appalled at some of the decisions this government has made about compensation for landowners, especially those involved in the Quake Outcasts situation. I think some of those decisions were appalling, irrational and unfair. And I don't trust this Minister or this government to make future decisions about those issues under this legislation any more than I trusted them under the SARA legislation. So if those words are going to be there, then our vote will be against. If those words are removed, our vote will be for this legislation. So I ask the Minister to seriously consider whether he really actually needs those words there, because I don't think he does. I think the provisions in the bill otherwise are more than sufficient to ensure a fair regime for compensation for landowners whose land is compulsorily acquired. So I want to make that a very, very important issue as far as New Zealand First is concerned. Finally, Mr. Speaker, I do think that the provisions, especially those in clauses 16 to 23 and 16 to 22 in particular, relating to the development and amendment of plans are perfectly appropriate if we are going to have a recreation of Christchurch in the way that we all hope will happen under this legislation. And again, I note with satisfaction that the Minister will have to have particular regard to the views of the stakeholders and also a good opportunity for the public to be consulted. So with that, Mr Speaker, New Zealand First will vote for the bill at this stage, and I hope we will be able to vote for it at later stages too.